Well, that night, the this captain that had jumped just ahead of me on D-Day, he was very close. He was probably within 50, 70 yards of where I had landed in the orchard. And he had with him one of these lights that was supposed to be used for identification. And another GI of some sort came along, and he asked him, climb at that tree or climb a tree and put it up with us some height where we can men can see it and assemble on the light, because that word had gotten out, I guess, that something of that would be friendly. Because there was men that sounded like they had been wounded or hurt in the area. There was fighting going on, not too close, but you could hear enemy fire. Their guns sounded different than our guns sounded. And we were in just a quiet old country lane where we were assembling. And men kept coming in from different directions. And as it turned out, there was, which I read later on in history, that we had assembled that night with our group. One of the largest groups of over 100 men had assembled together that night. And at dawn, as I mentioned earlier, that this Captain Nixon had spent 3 hours carousing, and he told us which direction we had to go. And we started out, and when we got out on a macadam road, or I guess it would, a very secondary road, there out in front of us as day was breaking, where our military or our Air Force had bombed it prior to our going in. I don't know how soon before, but there was an area where there wasn't a leaf on a tree, and all I could think of and remember is my stories and reading about World War I and no man's land and all. And in all directions for hundreds of yards around, there wasn't a leaf on a tree, and nothing but pockmarks and craters from the bombs that had fallen. And this, I found out later, was an area where there had been enormous coastal guns that they had come in. They knew they were there, and they had just bombed it so that they were not even able to activate them. As history came to be, as years later, as we found out later, the Germans had moved these big coastal guns. They weren't there where they had done all this bombing, but our intelligence said, bomb it. And I've spoken to people in France that live right, miles from there, and they said the ground actually shook when they, and it was not just a one-day bombing. They came over several days in a row and just bombed it. And at that particular point on this, where we knew where the road was or should be, there was a first German man that I saw dead. He had been a courier of some sort. He had a little motorbike, and the bike was over, and he was just lying there dead. And I can remember there was a major that was just ahead of me in this column as we moved down the road, and he turned around and he said, "Falvey, stick him, see if he's dead." And I looked up, and I said, "Major, you know he's dead." I guess he wanted to see what my reaction would be. And every time we tried, the column would start to move, and then there would be some sort of a firefight up front or along our sides, and it would stop. And it was slow progress. And then suddenly we were told that there was an 88, the German 88, off to our right. And somebody had discovered it and seen it. And the idea was that we were, a dozen of us or so, were to run down a hedgerow in the general direction of where this gun was, and we find any Germans, shoot and keep their heads down. And we had a fellow by the name of, oh, good grief, the name has left me right now. Well, anyway, he was a man out of Oklahoma. He came from Oklahoma, and he was quite a character. But he was going to run down the other side of this hedgerow while we fired and kept the Germans' heads down, and drop a grenade down the barrel of that gun. And it worked. We ran down the one side of this hedgerow, and I can remember being all excited over it. And there was no enemy fire coming at us, and we just kept firing at will, but it was a case of make sure that we weren't going to hit this fellow from our company that was going to drop the grenade. And he suddenly appeared on the scene and ran up to the gun, dropped the grenade down, destroyed the gun, turned around and right back to the road again, and we headed towards where we were trying to get to, the causeways. but the causeways by then had been well secured by other people. He received the some French croix de guerre or whatever it was for what he had done. It was unbelievable. He was a man without fear. Virgil Kimberling is his name. Virgil Kimberling. We had reached the point where we felt we should have all gotten to that night, or at least the general area. And the officer that of my particular, I was a communications sergeant, and our communications officer, he said, we don't have any communication equipment. Let's go down to the beach and see if we can find any equipment that's coming in, because at that time, late in the afternoon, there were tanks coming up the causeway, and there were some trucks coming up the causeway, and things felt good. There was no enemy fire close by, and we hiked down to myself, my friend Otto Sykes, and this officer. We walked. The name was Lieutenant Baranowski. We hiked down to the beach, which is a good mile or more, and that was Utah Beach. Now, Utah Beach was basically a piece of cake compared to Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach was a bloodbath. Utah Beach was not easy, but it was much, much easier than what they did on Omaha Beach. We got down there, and our officer went around meeting different people, and every once in a while a shell would come in from who knows where, and there'd be an explosion, everybody run for cover, and then there'd be nothing, whatever. But there was not the bloodbath that happened, as I found later, at Omaha Beach. And I figured, well, this was the way it was supposed to be. There were shells coming in, and sooner or later the guns that were firing, they'd be eliminated someplace along the line. And we were unable to find any radio equipment that we were looking for, batteries and anything that they could spare, but we couldn't find anything available. In that particular time, I can remember as we came down this causeway, I found I found a German, well, we call them a potato masher. It was a hand grenade, German hand grenade. It was a stick about 8-10 inches long, and a little knob at the end that looked like a can of beans on the end of it. And the stick had a hole in it. You would pull this little, it attached to a string, and you'd pull the string, and that would activate the grenade, and they would throw it. Well, I was carrying one like an old. I'd been an old seasoned veteran by now. I'd been there since 1 o'clock in the morning, and these men coming ashore were, hadn't even seen anything or had any action yet, and so I was the old trooper. So they were, boy, you've got a German hand grenade. How does that work? So I said, well, you just pull this string, and I grabbed a hold of it, and it just came out in my hand. And everybody ran for cover. I threw it, it never exploded, but thank goodness it was a dud. But I can remember that. And so after we found no equipment, we still had to get back up to where the regular outfit had been, or where they were waiting, sort of assembling, and deciding where do we go from here. And tanks were coming in and going up the causeway, and we asked one of the tank commanders, could we ride? And sure enough, get on. So we jumped up and we rode the tank up the causeway. We didn't have to hike it. And when we got up to the crossroad, I can remember getting off the tank and saying thank you. And there at this crossroad was a photographer talking Neanderthal times with a crank camera cranking film. And someplace, somewhere, I'm on a film from D-Day. I've never seen it. It's hidden in the archives someplace. Well, I know in many of my letters that I have written home, I mentioned that God had taken care of us, and that He looked down upon us and was treating many of us as we had hoped to be treated, and some had lost their way along the line. One of the stories that I always remember, I think it's Dick Van Dyke, not Dick Van Dyke, it was John Van Dyke, I think it was, that said, you can't begin to live until you dare to die. And there were so many times that all I could think of was, well, thank you, God. Thank you, God. I was blessed. And I can remember at one point, several days after D-Day, actually being blown right off the road. The shell came in and nothing hit me, but it actually lifted me off the ground, and I ended up in a ditch. And this is when you looked up and you knew there was a divine providence that was looking after some and wondering why you were spared and others were taken. And not that it preyed upon my mind, that I just felt blessed that I was being spared at all times, and never knowing when my time would come. And I was so fortunate that I started in at D-Day and went through the entire war right through till the war ended. But I can remember there was the old story, and it's true. There were no atheists in foxholes. But I don't remember very much men actually expressing their faith out loud. They were probably to themselves, and when there were moments when they had a chance, they would reflect back onto how they felt, and that the good Lord had taken care of us and taken care of us for today, and hope that tomorrow would bring the same. Oh yes, good grief. When that war ended, our regiment in the 101st Airborne was in Berchtesgaden. This is where Hitler had his mountain retreat. And we had been told to, of course, we raced across Germany in the last waning days of the war. At one point along the line, we ran into a concentration camp, and I remember seeing truckloads of these men that had been in the concentration camp, and they looked like skeletons and ghosts in their striped uniforms and just hanging on inside the trucks that were taking them to where they'd get some medical attention and being taken care of properly. And but we were told to race to Berchtesgaden. They wanted us to be there first. And there's been some sort of a controversy as to whether we really were or not, but I never remember seeing any other troops. And Berchtesgaden was a beautiful little Bavarian village, and we just told that, I didn't, but I mean the officers or different people would go to these homes and tell these people, you have 30 minutes to evacuate your house, we're moving in. Take whatever you find you need, and we're going to be in your home, and we don't know how long we're going to stay there. And there was beautiful, beautiful homes in Berchtesgaden. And I can remember German troops would come walking down the road and ask you, where do we go? And we just say, go home, go home. They had no idea that it was complete chaos for them, and they just couldn't believe that it was all over. And some of our men went out and set up basically what they called roadblocks, and if any German coming down the road had a gun or a wristwatch, our boys took it. And there was no trouble, no fighting over it. The war was over, and I think the hate that we felt or thought we should have when you were shooting and they were going to shoot at you, it ended. It ended right then and there. What was it all about? What did we accomplish? For the men that we lost, left behind, I often wondered, did we make a better world for ourselves, and they never had a chance to participate in a better world than what they had known. But the war is such... It's to me, and the men, I guess any man that fights in combat such as that, it seems so foolish, so ridiculous. Why we can't get along, why we can't understand one another and be men of good faith and love. And of course, I feel that love is of faith, love, and charity, that love is the strongest of them all. I was never, and even to this day, I'm not a man that's able to very easily quote any scripture. I have read the Bible through twice, and I often wondered, there was so much that I didn't get, and it's in there, and they tell me it's in there, but I didn't gather it. But I carried with me a little New Testament that the Sunday school teacher had given me when I was going to church in Mount Vernon, New York, and I carried it with me through the war. And in that little New Testament, I still have it. It's there in my bedroom. My mother had X'd out or made little X's and marks through the entire Testament, and I'd open it up and I would read the pages that where I felt that these were the important things that she felt that I should read and should know about. And I used it quite often when the chance was there. And I can remember on Christmas Day in Bastogne, in a foxhole, snow about knee deep, and it was a sunshiny day, and we were on a sort of an outpost right on the corner of, where our line ended, and of course the Germans began. And I was reading a piece out of my Bible and heard a noise, and I looked up, and there were 4 officers. They could have just as well have been German officers, but they were men of our battalion that had come around to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and want to know how we were making out. But had they been the enemy, I was a goner. But I can remember that just as clearly, and I could find that foxhole today. Matter of fact, in 1986, I was over there with 3 other men, and I did find that foxhole that I had been on. It seemed like a special place to be on Christmas Day. Like 2 days before that, they had given us some white bread. We didn't get very much rations. It's the only time in my life I ever really felt hunger, that I was really starving. I needed food. And several days before Christmas, I know they had brought some white bread up, and I managed to gather a few extra pieces, and I put them between my outer garment and my body, saved them, and that was for sort of a gift for the other boys that I was with on Christmas morning, and greatly appreciated. Just a morsel of food. It's hard to imagine. It was worlds apart. It's, I often think of it. I look out here on winter's nights when the temperature's down to about 0 and the snow is about knee deep. To think I lived in the ground at that particular time. It's hard to imagine and hard to believe. And this is when we first had men come up with trench foot, where they actually, things had gotten so bad, some of them they had to be amputated. They lost their feet or parts of their feet. I know as bad as it got with me, I had frostbite, but that was about as bad as mine had gotten. Of course, when I went, the medics looked at them, I was hoping, well, maybe it'd be bad enough that they could evacuate me, and send me back. Not bad enough. Everybody was looking for some sort of a ticket to send me out, send me home, or get me off the line.